So, David, tell me about Saturday night. What were you thinking and feeling as the results came in from each state and territory? We know you've been covering this for so long, so keen to hear your thoughts.
Well, in some ways, it was a disheartening moment because so many people had invested so much in this change, and Indigenous Australians in particular had been drawn into this nationwide debate, which was incredibly difficult at times and saw a lot of antagonism unleashed, sometimes outright hate. There was some racism in some quarters, but I think for the most part, people engaged in the argument with goodwill. But a very bruising debate and result for Indigenous Australians, but also in line with a trend through the year. And one of my first reactions was that the campaign for change had really been failing in slow motion through the year. It hadn't picked up momentum. All our polling indicated that it was losing ground month by month, and that didn't really change until a slight stabilisation in the end. And so it was one of those odd things in democratic politics where the numbers were showing that it wasn't going to work, and yet the advocates for this change believed that recognition for Indigenous Australians had to be recognition with a voice. It had to have that structural element to it in the Constitution, with an advisory group set up to listen to Indigenous Australians. And this model was essential to the referendum campaign. Even when it appeared likely to be defeated, that was still the argument, and that didn't change. In normal, situations, in different situations, an election, for instance, people adjust course when they see that their argument is not cutting through and not building up a great momentum in the community. Here it was different. There was an offer from Indigenous Australians, from the Indigenous leadership at the Uluru Statement of the Heart. This was their proposal. It came from them, and so that set the tone for the entire debate this year. But it was a difficult thing to persuade Australians to support, and the outcome actually did confirm history, which is that a partisan referendum is extremely unlikely to be accepted. Australians, many of them, were unsure about this, and with a change to the Constitution, they need to have an assurance that it's acceptable, that it won't be a drastic change that will, upset, the nation's stability in a way. And that can only really come about through bipartisanship, and it wasn't there.
And so can you break down the results for us? What were some of the most telling results, and what can we glean from them?
Well, some of the most telling results were that this was not just about a rejection of the referendum from states like Western Australia and Queensland, where we knew that there were people who were against the voice. Public polling, not just the Result Political Monitor in our pages, but in polling across the board, a very broad trend across all polls, showed that those states were against. There was hope for the yes side early on that states like Victoria would get behind the voice, that they might be able to get 4 out of the 6 states. But there was a fairly emphatic majority against in Victoria. I think if you're getting somewhere around 54, 55, 56, that's a significant majority. It's not just a sort of a narrow outcome. And in New South Wales as well, there was also, a clear majority. The only place that was a majority yes was the ACT. Of course, there was also this geographic factor, which might also be an income factor, which was that in the inner seats in Melbourne and Sydney, there was clear support for the voice. I saw this because working at headquarters in Sydney over the weekend, it was clear on polling day that there was support, many more yes volunteers. The no people were totally outnumbered. I think I saw 2 at one of the polling stations in North Sydney, for instance. And I saw younger volunteers in favour of yes. I bumped into somebody who remarked upon the fact that a lot of the people handing out pamphlets for yes were women. There were 2 blokes handing out for no. It was an insight into into the dynamic in city seats, and that's a reality for the Teal independent MPs, where they were in favour of yes, and their electorates were in favour of yes. And this is an important thing to look at through the prism of democratic politics in Australia in general. Those independent MPs who unseated Liberals, they're not out of touch with their communities. They're quite in touch with their communities. And you're now looking at the big question of whether that's a big structural shift in Australian politics, not just an outcome from last election, but something that's going to continue for some time.
Okay, and you mentioned there before that you weren't so surprised by the outcome because it proves what we know from history, which is that without bipartisan support, referendums don't tend to get up here where they don't get up. So do you think that the Albanese government made a major misstep in pushing forward with this all-or-nothing referendum?
That's a really hard question to answer with any total clarity, because I think looking at this from the outside, the government and the Yes campaigners went ahead with something where they were losing ground through the year. They didn't change course, and I think I get this from readers. We can see it in the observations, the reaction from Australians to this outcome. Why didn't they try a different way? And I'm sort of giving voice to this by openly questioning why one of the options wasn't simply to go for recognition as a symbolic change in the Constitution, maybe ask about a voice as well, but have some option where you could have at least had an outcome here. But I think it's important to recognise the other side of that debate. The request for the voice came from Indigenous leaders. It came from Uluru in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and it wasn't just individuals like Noel Pearson, Megan Davis as well. There was a broad group of them. They're not all Indigenous Australia, because there's always going to be debate and division in any community, but it was their proposal, and they had a very strong belief that recognition had to have some structural, practical element to it, and that meant the voice. The voice to Parliament, the voice to executive government, an elected group that would represent Indigenous Australians. So once that was decided and there was no willingness to really back off and compromise on that, then I think the proposition to Australians had to be what it was, even though I think there'd be people looking at this now thinking, well, I would have voted for recognition, but I didn't get that chance. And I think part of this is a frustration that this came from people who thought that they had the best proposal. But in a referendum, you have to deal with the Australian public. And if you can't give them something that assuages their concerns, that makes them confident about what they're voting yes to, then you're going to struggle.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about, I guess, what next from the government, because we know that Anthony Albanese has already said that in the event of a loss at this referendum, that he wouldn't legislate a voice to Parliament. And yesterday, Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles said that the government, was not looking towards another referendum on this matter for constitutional recognition. So what do you think we'll see next from the government, to close the gap?
I don't think there's going to be another referendum. All the messaging from the government is that this was it. I don't see any reason for them to reopen a debate about a different referendum. And that means a referendum just on recognition won't be appealing to Indigenous leaders after this outcome, and certainly won't be appealing to the government. So I don't think that's something that they'll approach. While we're on that sort of subject, I think that the idea of a referendum on the Republic is, of course, near impossible right now. This has shown just how difficult it is to change the Constitution. It's a reminder of historic reality for Australia. And so I don't think that that's going to be, the next stop. Peter Dutton has raised the idea of another referendum just on recognition. He said it in an interview. I don't think it was something that he meant to put out there as a grand plan, because he's walked back from it ever since. So I don't think that that's a realistic possibility. It's a talking point. I don't think that Peter Dutton really sees it as something that he wants to prosecute. His proposals on Indigenous Australia are basically, let's review things, let's audit spending, let's hold a royal commission into child sexual abuse, in Indigenous communities. He wants reviews. The onus on the government is to show that after this debate, so difficult for so many for so long, they have to get back to practical change. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of patience for more language about it all, more debate about it all. The government will want to move on to things like cost of living, things like managing the economy, things like health and education. But they must show results. They must focus on closing the gap in Indigenous disadvantage. This whole debate has highlighted the reality there, and it's a really grim reality. So they've got to get results without making it the subject of the nightly news and the headlines day after day of more speeches and more debate.
And do you have any insights, I guess, into perhaps conversations you've had with people in government about what sort of practical ideas or, might come to the table in terms of what they might be looking at next to close the gap? Because we know that it's so bad.
No, I think it's so early for them to deal with the question of what will they do instead of this option. And I think that early on in the entire process, after the Uluru Statement, local and regional voices were important. Those ideas kind of got lost on the way through with the focus on the national voice. That could be one way forward, but I don't think the government's really ready to canvass what they do instead.
And just back to Anthony Albanese specifically, where does this result leave him with regards to the pledge that he made when he was elected, that he committed to the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, which of course means voice, treaty, and a truth-telling. What implication do you think this result has on that?
It's still fairly early to really look at the consequences over the long term. But I think that those who want voice, treaty, truth have to contend with the fact that a rejection of the voice is not an endorsement of treaty or a Makarrata Commission as other ways forward. And this is going to be a difficult issue to contend with over time, because there were voices who said, don't go with the Indigenous voice, we need treaty instead. Lydia Thorpe being a prime example, former Greens senator, now the independent senator in Victoria. But that message, I don't think, resonated. According to our polling, the people who were, you might call, progressive no on the voice, only about 5% of the no vote was really coming to it from that point of view. So I don't think there's an endorsement here of treaty instead. And I don't think that there's some way of pointing to this outcome to say, people are ready for a Makarrata Commission. I think the overwhelming message is they're not.
Which brings me to something I really wanted to ask you about, which is, I guess, how this reflects on us as a nation. Some people are going to take from this that we are a racist nation. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what this result says about us?
No, it's not a fair assessment at all. I think there was racism in the campaign. I saw it on social media when I did some coverage of how the No campaign was prosecuting the case on social media. And I'm not saying that No campaign leaders like Warren Mundine or Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price were being racist. Not saying that at all. I think they made their case very strongly on social media and it resonated with people. However, when you go on social media, you're encountering some of the ugly corners of the community, and there was racism there. So, some of that was unleashed by the debate. That's a reality. But I think it's really fundamentally wrong to look at this outcome and start questioning or start making sweeping generalisations about Australia as a community. It's not a racist country as a community. There's goodwill in a lot of the community, and people who voted no, many of them did it for reasons that they thought were in good faith. For instance, concern about the legality, the legal questions of conflict in the High Court, things like that. People could vote no because they could see that Indigenous people were not united behind this. If you see Lydia Thorpe saying no, you see Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price saying no, Linda Burney saying yes, well, if they could not agree, how could they expect Australians to agree on this? I think some of these questions are really fundamental. So generalisations about a racist country are really just not justified. But also, I think there will be an element out of this where people say, look, there were lies, there was misinformation. They'll paint it as a sort of a cheating of the Australian public with the outcome. And I think that's always a dangerous way to go. It's a democratic outcome. Democratic politics means you need to assemble a majority for what you want. Fighting the good fight for a worthy cause when you get pretty clear signs that it's going to be defeated, that may seem noble and it can be brave, it can be courageous. But the end of the game in democratic politics is to assemble the numbers to change the country.
Okay, so it's interesting what you had to say there in terms of the reflections that some people are having that this paints us in a racist light. But I'm just wondering, I guess, about how this result reflects on what people's desire is with regards to the status quo in terms of the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Because Anthony Albanese asserted on Saturday night after the result came in, he said that the people who voted no were not arguing for the status quo. But then Julian Leeser, before the result came in, he had said if we vote no, it is an endorsement of a broken system. So does this speak to a desire for the status quo or perhaps an overwhelming indifference to the disadvantage of Indigenous Australians?
I think there is an element of indifference because, we have a diverse community. We have people who need to get on with their lives and have got, challenges in their own lives, whether it's financial or otherwise. Nobody really said that on any side of this argument that what we have now is adequate. There are different ideas about changing it. The only really concrete idea to make a forward step was the voice from the government and from Indigenous leaders who backed it. The no side never really said, here's a different way. They do emphasise local and regional voices, but their concept for those is pretty much as vague as the national voice concept put forward by Yes 23, the Yes campaign organisation. So we're dealing in abstract concepts here. There is no concrete plan from Peter Dutton as opposition leader, Senator Nampijinpa Price as the Indigenous Australian spokesperson for the coalition, to make exact policy changes. Yeah, sure, audit the spending. That may then lead to something. But does that mean if a coalition government gets elected that they're going to need 2 years to figure out what to do? And I don't think that's a satisfactory situation where this kind of debate requires people to say, here's a plan.
Okay, and I'm curious as to what you think about how this result from the referendum, where that leads us, I guess, on the global stage, because we know that our constitution is the only one of a first world nation with a colonial history that doesn't recognize its first peoples. We know Canada, New Zealand, and the United States all provide greater constitutional recognition of their first peoples than Australia does. So do you have any thoughts about that, why we stand out, why we're different when it comes to this?
Because there's an inherent scepticism about changing the constitution. Maybe it's an inherent conservatism in the Australian public. And I think we know that from history. We've been reminded of it now. And changing the constitution is incredibly difficult. I think the only way to do it will be to make it a very benign change that Indigenous leaders probably will think meaningless, but which Australians in general might think, okay, well, I can make that change without feeling too nervous about what I'm doing, and it will probably have bipartisan support. There doesn't seem to be that willingness to do it. Maybe it'll never happen, but I think that would be the only path forward. It's interesting that you mentioned other countries around the world, because at one point Anthony Albanese made that claim, and I thought that can't possibly be real. I better fact check that. And of course, when you fact check it, you find it's true.
So we're just more conservative?
I think that Australia as a country is relatively conservative. We often get reminded of it in the polls. We have a Labor government at a federal level. It's there by a fairly thin majority. So I think there was an element to this debate on the yes side where the polls showed Anthony Albanese to be very popular, Labor to be far ahead of the coalition, and there was a sense that they could get this done even if it was partisan. But they've just been reminded of historic reality in Australian politics.
And so where does this leave us now going forward for reconciliation? Obviously, this is a process that our country has been grappling with for decades and decades and decades. We know that Marsha Langton, a key Yes supporter before the results came in, she said that actually, regardless of what happened, reconciliation is dead, she said. The nation has been poisoned and there is no fix for this terrible outcome. But then Linda Burney, on hearing the result, she said that a new generation of Indigenous leaders are going to emerge and continue to fight for reconciliation. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's hard for me to make an assessment of a way forward for reconciliation. I'm really looking at it from the outside. And so when Marsha Langton says that the nation has sort of been poisoned in a way by this debate, I really take that on board. I think it's been a disaster for reconciliation. And though I think that the government will make the case that they can find another way and reconciliation will be pursued in other ways. And other political leaders will say that. And I guess we should commend them for saying that, because there is an obligation on them to find a different way forward. But at the moment, I can't see that way. I think that this is a significant rebuff, a very big defeat. It is troubling about what it means for reconciliation, and I can't see a different way forward at this point. And I think it's such a bruising defeat for people who wanted this change to the Constitution, from Indigenous leaders who thought that this was a reasonable thing to ask for, that I find it difficult to see what could be offered as a different way forward.
And I wanted to ask you about what you think we've learned about ourselves as a people and what we believe in that perhaps we didn't know before the referendum. I know you've spoken about this just recently, but I'm wondering how you feel about this now that the results have actually come in. I mean, we all sort of knew for quite a while we were expecting this result, but perhaps it's different when you actually get it, and such a resounding no. Do you think we've learned anything about ourselves that we didn't know before?
I think we've been reminded of things that are there before our eyes. We're a diverse community, lots of different people going about their lives without paying attention to national debate, without being engaged in arguments about reconciliation. A lot of people have got a lot of things to get on with in Australian life, just at a day-to-day level. We're more multicultural than we were, say, with the 1999 referendum on the Republic. I mean, that was the last referendum. The country's changed. And so I think the media has changed. Where people get their information has changed. Social media wasn't around in the 1999 Republic referendum. Imagine if it had been. It would have been a different dynamic. This is the first referendum of that modern era, and it tells us that negative campaigning is incredibly powerful. You can't control messages in the jungle of places like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Social media is fairly wild and unpredictable, and no campaigns can be incredibly effective in places like that. I do think that there's a possibility of a spiral in campaigning in general toward negativity. Political professionals will look at this result and they'll assess what worked. And the message is fairly clear. Negativity worked. Division worked. Heighten that and you will succeed. That's the message to Peter Dutton. It does raise a question for me about whether it means that we'll see an increase in negative campaigning by the coalition when we're accustomed to thinking that when you go to a general election, you must offer a positive future. I think we'll see a shift towards emphasising a positive future in your public remarks while your black ops team in the back office go about with the kind of negative campaigning we saw during the referendum. But we do see campaign tactics where sometimes we see political leaders who don't really seem to care if they get caught out with a lie. And that's because they're assuming that voters aren't seeing the mainstream media anymore. They're only seeing the lie getting packaged and broadcast or spread on places like TikTok. What does it matter if a fact-checking newspaper calls out the lie if it's running rampant on TikTok? That's the dynamic now in politics. We saw some of that in the referendum campaign. I do think it's a reminder that we need a debate over truth in advertising laws in politics. We do need more disclosure. We don't even know who donated to the yes side or the no side because those documents won't be released until early next year. How is that a transparent electoral system for voters in Australia? So there's some big questions about how we conduct politics in Australia out of this outcome.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us.
Thanks, Samantha.